The day my family left me behind, the house smelled like sunscreen and burnt toast. I remember standing in the doorway with my shoes in my hands, watching the taillights fade down the street, thinking they'll come back. 13-year-old girls believe in second chances the way they believe in birthdays. Absolutely, without proof. It was my birthday. I stood there longer than I should have, the screen door slapping gently against its frame each time the wind nudged it, like the house itself was asking if I was coming in or going out. My cake, store-bought, vanilla with thin blue frosting, sat untouched on the counter. Someone had written, "Happy birthday, Elena," in shaky cursive, the letters already beginning to sweat under the kitchen light. I didn't cry right away. I think part of me was still waiting for the sound of tires turning back, for my mother's voice calling my name like she'd forgotten her purse, or me. But the street stayed quiet. That was the first time I learned how silence can be louder than yelling. Before that day, my life had been ordinary in the way middle children often are, quietly crowded, easily overlooked. I lived in a narrow two-story house with pale siding that always looked like it needed another coat of paint. My parents, David and Karen Vance, liked to say we were a close-knit family, though I later learned that was something people said when they didn't want to explain the gaps. I had two older sisters, Sienna and Chloe, close in age, close in everything else too. They shared clothes, secrets, inside jokes that floated just out of my reach. At dinner, they spoke over each other, their laughter overlapping like music I wasn't invited to dance to. I learned early how to make myself smaller at the table, how to fold my napkin neatly and chew quietly so no one would notice how little I said. My parents weren't cruel. That's important to say. They were busy, distracted, enamored with the idea of who we were supposed to be rather than who we actually were. Sienna was beautiful and sharp-tongued, already practicing confidence like it was a language she'd been born speaking. Chloe was softer, dramatic in her own way, always the first to cry and the first to be comforted. And me? I was the space between them. The pause, the extra. I did well in school, kept my room tidy, learned to fold laundry without being asked. I thought being easy would make me lovable. I thought if I needed less, I'd matter more. That summer, my parents planned a vacation to Florida. Sienna had just graduated high school. Chloe was starting college applications, and they said it was important to celebrate as a family. I remember sitting on the stairs, listening to them talk about hotel rooms and beach chairs, my knees pulled tight to my chest. "What about Elena?" I heard my mother ask, her voice distant, like she was talking from another room. There was a pause. Papers rustled. My father cleared his throat. "She can stay with Aunt Marlene," he said. Or wasn't Julian back in town? They said his name like it came with a bad taste. Julian Reed was my mother's older brother. Estranged, they called him. Successful, they said with a roll of the eyes. He lived in a different city, wore tailored suits, and sent Christmas cards that came with handwritten notes no one ever replied to. I'd met him twice in my life. Once when I was 6, he knelt down to my level, asked me what I liked to read, and actually waited for the answer. The second time, he came to my school play and clapped louder than anyone else, even when I missed my line. I remembered him because he remembered me. But when the vacation plans were finalized, no one mentioned him again. Instead, my parents decided I'd stay home for a few days until Aunt Marlene could figure something out. The morning they left, the house was chaos, suitcases by the door. Chloe yelling about her charger. Sienna complaining about the humidity. My mother kissed my cheek absently, already reaching for her sunglasses. "We'll celebrate when we get back," she said. "Okay, sweetheart?" I nodded. I always nodded. They drove away at 7:12 a.m. By noon, it was clear no one was coming back for me. By evening, I was hungry and afraid and pretending I wasn't. That's when the doorbell rang.
I wiped my hands on my shorts before opening the door, expecting a neighbor or foolishly my parents. Instead, there he was, Julian Reed, taller than I remembered, lines at the corners of his eyes, a quiet steadiness about him, like he didn't rush through the world. He looked past me into the empty house. "Happy birthday, Elena," he said softly. I didn't ask how he knew. I didn't ask why he was there. I just stood frozen, my throat tight, my fingers numb. "They forgot," I whispered. Julian didn't flinch. He didn't make excuses for them. He didn't say, "I'm sure they didn't mean to." He simply nodded once, like he was accepting a fact that confirmed something he'd long suspected. "Pack a bag," he said gently. "You're coming with me." That was the moment my life split into before and after. As we drove away from that house, the one with the peeling paint and the untouched cake, I watched it shrink in the rearview mirror. I thought I'd feel guilty. I thought I'd feel scared. Instead, I felt something else. Relief. Like I could finally breathe without worrying who I was inconveniencing. I didn't know then that Julian would become my guardian, my teacher, my anchor. I didn't know he would teach me how to stand tall in rooms that once made me shrink, or how to speak calmly when my voice wanted to tremble. All I knew was that, for the first time, someone had chosen me on purpose. And sometimes, that's all a child needs to survive. Julian's house didn't smell like anything I recognized. That was the first thing I noticed when we walked inside. No lingering perfume, no burnt coffee, no noise from a television left on for company. Just clean air, faintly lemony, and the quiet hum of something working the way it was supposed to. The floors were dark wood, polished but not shiny, and the walls held framed photographs spaced far apart, like each one had been given permission to breathe. He set my bag down by the stairs, then crouched in front of me so our eyes were level. "You're safe here," he said. "Not loudly, not dramatically, just fact. We'll figure everything else out together." I didn't know how to respond to that. So I nodded again, my old habit though. Something in my chest loosened when he said together. That first night, he ordered takeout from a small Italian place around the corner. He asked me what I liked, waited while I thought about it, then ordered exactly that. No substitutions, no sighs, no jokes about being picky. We ate at the kitchen table with real plates, not paper ones. And he lit a single candle because, he said, birthdays deserve a little ceremony. When I finally cried, it was quiet and embarrassing and unstoppable. Julian didn't rush to stop it. He just passed me a napkin, then another, and let the silence hold us both. The next morning, he called a lawyer. I listened from the hallway as he explained the situation, short, precise sentences. No embellishment. He asked questions I didn't understand, nodded at answers I couldn't hear, and thanked the man on the other end with a calmness that suggested he wasn't asking permission so much as laying groundwork. By the end of the week, he was my legal guardian. My parents didn't fight it. They signed the papers with the same detachment they signed school forms and permission slips, barely looking up. My mother hugged me stiffly, smelling like sunscreen again. My father patted my shoulder and said, "This is probably for the best." I waited for an apology. It never came. Julian never spoke badly about them. Not once. But he never excused them either. When I asked, because I did ask, one night when the house felt too quiet and my thoughts too loud, he said, "Some people don't know how to show up for the roles they're given. That doesn't make it your fault." I carried that sentence with me for years. Life with Julian moved at a different pace. Mornings were quiet, structured. Breakfast at the table. Newspaper folded neatly beside his coffee. He asked about my day and actually listened to the answer. When I struggled in math, he hired a tutor without making me feel ashamed. When I brought home a book report with a teacher's note praising my writing, he framed it. "You see this?" he said, tapping the glass. "This is evidence." "Of what?" I asked. "Of who you are when someone gives you space to be yourself." I started sitting straighter without realizing it. I learned how to look people in the eye. I learned that intelligence wasn't something to hide to make others comfortable. Julian took me to museums on weekends, asked me what I thought about paintings. Never corrected me when I got things wrong, just asked better questions. My parents called occasionally. Birthdays, holidays, obligations disguised as concern. Sienna talked about college parties and internships. Chloe cried about breakups and exams. They asked how I was in the way people ask, when they don't expect much of an answer. Julia never hovered during those calls. He gave me privacy, then tea afterward. "Blood makes relatives," he said once, "but presence makes family." By the time I turned 18, Julian had become the axis around which my life turned. He taught me how to manage money, how to read contracts, how to speak calmly when emotions ran high. He attended my graduations, sat front row, clapped until his hands were red. My parents sent cards. After college, I moved into my own apartment, but Julian and I spoke every Sunday. Same time, same rhythm. He never missed a call unless he warned me in advance. Even when he got sick, though, he didn't call it that. At first he kept the routine. "It's nothing," he said. "Just tired." It wasn't nothing. The diagnosis came quietly, like so many important things do. By the time he told me, he already had a plan. Treatment schedules, legal documents, a will. "I want you to read this," he said, handing me a folder one afternoon. I tried to refuse. He insisted. "We didn't talk about death directly. We talked about continuity, about responsibility, about honoring the work you're given." Julian passed away on a rainy Tuesday morning. The kind of rain that doesn't storm, it settles. At the funeral, my parents came. So did Sienna and Chloe. They hugged me awkwardly, murmured condolences. I stood between them and the casket, feeling like a bridge they hadn't earned the right to cross. Weeks later, we gathered in a quiet law office for the reading of the will. My parents arrived first, well-dressed, expectant. Sienna whispered about property values. Chloe asked about investments. None of them looked at me until Julian's attorney cleared his throat. Elena Vance, he said, is the sole heir to Julian Reed's estate. The room went still. My mother laughed once, sharp and disbelieving. My father frowned. Sienna's smile fell away. Chloe's eyes darted toward me, searching for something guilt, maybe, or fear. You've got to be kidding, Sienna said. The attorney didn't blink. Julian had been very clear, and in that moment, as the truth settled over them like cold air, I felt something unfamiliar rise up inside me. Not anger, not triumph, clarity. The silence in that law office wasn't empty. It was crowded with assumptions, with regrets, with things no one wanted to say out loud. My mother recovered first. She always did. She smoothed her skirt, crossed her ankles, and offered the attorney a tight smile that looked practiced in mirrors. There must be some mistake, she said. Julian was generous. He wouldn't exclude his own family. The attorney adjusted his glasses. Miss Vance, your brother's instructions were explicit. There is no ambiguity in the language of the will. My father leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. We're not asking for much, he said, voice measured, reasonable. Just fairness. Fairness. The word hovered between us, heavy and misplaced. Sienna scoffed under her breath. She barely even knew him, she said, nodding toward me without looking directly at my face. I mean, come on. This is ridiculous. I watched them talk about me as if I weren't sitting there, as if I were still the quiet middle child on the stairs, listening from the margins. For a moment, the old reflex kicked in the urge to shrink, to disappear, to let the louder voices decide the story. But then I felt Julian's hand on my shoulder. Not literally, but memory has its own weight. Speak when it matters, he used to say. And when you do, be clear. I cleared my throat. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. I lived with him for 13 years, I said. My voice surprised me steady even. He raised me. He showed up every day. This wasn't a last-minute decision. My mother's eyes flicked to me, sharp and assessing, like she was seeing me for the first time in years and didn't like what she found. We didn't abandon you, she said quickly. You know that. Things were complicated. They were convenient, I replied. The word landed harder than I expected. Chloe's lips parted, as if she wanted to say something in apology. Maybe. But she closed them again. Old habits die quietly. The attorney continued reading, his voice calm, professional. Properties, accounts, personal effects. Julian had left instructions for scholarships, donations, even the care of his garden. Everything accounted for. Everything intentional. When he finished, my father stood abruptly. This is outrageous, he said. You can't honestly expect us to accept this. I met his gaze. For the first time in my life, I didn't look away. I don't expect anything from you, I said. I stopped doing that a long time ago. Sienna stood too, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. You think you're better than us now? She snapped. Because you lived in his fancy house? Because you got lucky? I thought about the nights I studied until my eyes burned. The mornings I woke up early to prove I deserved the space I took up. The quiet, patient guidance of a man who never let me confuse luck with effort. I don't think I'm better, I said. I think I'm prepared. The room felt smaller after that. My mother gathered her purse, her movements sharp. We'll be speaking to our own lawyer, she said. This isn't over. The attorney nodded politely. Of course. They left without saying goodbye. I stayed behind, signing papers with a hand that only trembled once. When it was done, the attorney slid the final document toward me. Your uncle spoke of you often, he said. He was very proud. Outside, the rain had stopped. The pavement glistened, reflecting a sky that looked newly washed. I stood on the steps of the building for a moment, breathing in the cool air, feeling the weight of what had just happened settle into something solid and real. Julian's house was quiet when I returned. His chair by the window still held the shape of him. I walked through the room slowly, touching the backs of chairs, the edges of shelves, grounding myself in the life we'd built. I went into his study last. The desk was exactly as he'd left it. Papers neatly stacked. A fountain pen resting beside a leather-bound notebook. I opened it. Inside, in his careful handwriting, was a single page addressed to me. Elena, if you're reading this, Then I've done what I set out to do. You don't owe anyone an explanation. You don't owe anyone forgiveness. Live well. That is enough. I closed the notebook and sat there for a long time, letting the quiet wrap around me. Later that week, my phone rang. It was my mother. "We should talk," she said. Her tone softer now, edged with something like uncertainty. I looked around the room, the books Julian had recommended, the plant he'd taught me not to overwater, the framed report that still hung in the hallway. "I think we've said enough," I replied. She sighed. "You don't have to shut us out." I thought about 13-year-old me, standing in a doorway with shoes in her hands. "I didn't," I said. "You did." I hung up before she could answer. That night, I slept deeply for the first time since Julian's passing. Grief doesn't disappear. It changes shape. It becomes something you carry without letting it bend you in half. In the weeks that followed, I began the work of honoring him not with grand gestures, but with consistency. I funded the scholarships he'd outlined. I kept the garden alive. I hosted quiet dinners for people who had shown up for me when it mattered. My family sent messages. Some apologetic, some accusatory, some carefully neutral. I read them all. I replied to none, because the truth was, I didn't need their approval to validate my life anymore. Julian had given me something far more durable. A sense of self. Grief has a way of rearranging time. Days passed quickly, but moments stretched. I would find myself standing in Julian's kitchen, kettle boiling, and suddenly remember the way he used to hum barely audible while waiting for the water to heat. Or I'd open a drawer and catch the faint scent of his cologne, clean and subtle, and feel my chest tighten like a fist closing slowly. In the middle of that quiet morning, my family reappeared not with comfort, but with urgency. The first letter arrived 2 weeks after the will reading. My father's handwriting, still neat, still controlled. "We need to resolve this like adults," it read. Julian was emotional. "You know that. We should talk about what's fair." I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. I didn't throw it away. Julian had taught me that avoidance and erasure were not the same thing. Then came a message from Chloe. Short, tentative. "I miss you. Can we get coffee?" I stared at my phone for a long time before replying. "I don't think that would be helpful right now," I typed. "Take care." Sienna didn't bother with softness. She showed up. It was a Thursday afternoon. I was in the garden, trimming back the lavender Julian had planted years earlier. The gate creaked open behind me. "Wow," she said. "So this is it." I turned slowly. She stood there in sunglasses and heels, arms crossed, eyes scanning the house like she was appraising it for resale. "This is my home," I said. She laughed once, humorless. "Must be nice." I set the shears down. "What do you want, Sienna?" She took off her sunglasses, her eyes sharp, familiar. "You can't honestly think this is right. Mom's barely sleeping. Dad's furious. And you're just what cutting us off?" I brushed dirt from my hands. "I'm not cutting anyone off. I'm just not fixing what I didn't break." She stepped closer. "He poisoned you against us." The accusation hung in the air, absurd and heavy. Julian's voice echoed in my mind again. "Don't argue with someone who needs a villain." "He didn't need to," I said. "You did that yourselves." Her face flushed. "We were kids too, Elena." I met her gaze. So was I. For a moment, something flickered across her face. Uncertainty. Maybe. Then it hardened. "You're going to regret this," she said. "Family is all you have in the end." She left without waiting for a response. That night, I sat in Julian's study again, the room dim except for the desk lamp. I thought about family, the one I was born into, and the one I'd chosen. I thought about obligation disguised as love, and love that asked for nothing in return. I didn't regret a thing. The legal challenge came a month later. My parents contested the will, citing undue influence, emotional manipulation. The words felt sterile on paper, stripped of context and truth. I hired a lawyer. A good one. Julian had insisted I keep a list. The depositions were exhausting. Questions about my childhood, about my relationship with Julian, about money, expectations, resentment. I answered calmly, honestly, without embellishment. When it was my mother's turn, she cried. "I just want my daughter back," she said, dabbing at her eyes. I watched from across the room, feeling something strange and distant. Pity, maybe. Or clarity. The judge ruled in my favor. Julian's will stood. The day was finalized. I walked through the house one last time, not because I was leaving, but because I was staying. I paused in the hallway where my framed report still hung. I touched the glass lightly. "You were right," I whispered. This was evidence. That evening, I hosted a small dinner. Nothing fancy. Just people who had earned a seat at my table. Friends, colleagues, a former professor. The neighbor who had checked on Julian when I was traveling for work. We ate pasta and drank wine and told stories about the man who had shaped us all in different ways. When the house finally grew quiet, I stood by the window, watching the lights in the garden glow softly against the dark. I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who waited in doorways, who believed love was something you earned by being easy to forget. She was gone now. In her place stood a woman who knew her worth without needing it confirmed. And that, more than any inheritance, was Julian's greatest gift. The world didn't change overnight once the legal dust settled. There was no dramatic moment where everything suddenly felt lighter. Healing, I learned, isn't a clean line. It's a series of small decisions made consistently, even when no one is watching. I went back to work the Monday after the ruling. Same desk, same routine. I made my coffee the way Julian liked it, strong, with just a touch of milk, and sat down to answer emails. A few colleagues offered quiet congratulations, careful not to make it about money. They understood, somehow, that this had never been about that. My parents tried again. This time, they sent an invitation, formal, almost polite. Dinner at their house. Just family, my mother wrote, as if the phrase itself could erase years of absence. I didn't reply right away. Instead, I drove to the coast. Julian and I used to go there once a year, usually in early spring, when the crowds were thin and the air still carried a bite. I walked along the shoreline, shoes in hand, the cold water numbing my feet, and thought about the idea of closure. People talk about it like a door you slam shut, but sometimes it's just a window you stop looking through. When I returned home, I wrote a letter. Not long, not angry. I'm not ready for that kind of conversation, I wrote. I hope you're well. Please respect my space. I mailed it the next morning. Sienna sent a message a few days later. No accusation this time. Just a link to an article about sibling estrangement. Followed by, I guess I didn't realize how bad it was. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering. It wasn't loud, I typed back. That's why you didn't notice. She didn't respond. Chloe tried again too, this time with a voicemail. She cried, said she was sorry, said she felt like she'd failed me. I believed her, and that made it harder. I saved the message. I didn't call her back. Julian used to say that forgiveness doesn't require proximity. You can release someone without reopening the door. So that's what I did. Months passed. The garden bloomed. The lavender I'd trimmed sent up purple spikes, their scent drifting through the open windows. I took over managing the scholarship fund, met students whose lives were shifting in quiet, powerful ways because someone believed in them early. One afternoon, a young woman shook my hand and said, "I hope I can be like you someday." I smiled, thinking of a man who once told a scared girl that evidence mattered. "I hope you become even more," I replied. The call from my father came unexpectedly, late one evening. His voice sounded older than I remembered. "I don't understand you," he said. Not angrily, just tired. "I know," I said. He exhaled. "Your mother thinks, she thinks maybe we could start over." I looked around the living room, Julian's living room now mine, the soft lamplight, the bookshelf filled with margins marked by his careful pen. "Some things can't be restarted," I said. "They can only be learned from." He was quiet for a long time. "I hope you're happy," he said finally. "I am," I answered. And for once, it wasn't something I had to convince myself of. After we hung up, I sat alone, listening to the house settle. I thought about how happiness used to feel fragile to me, like something that could be taken away if I wasn't careful. Now it felt sturdy, earned. Julian had left me his estate, yes. But more importantly, he'd left me a blueprint for living. Show up, speak clearly, choose kindness without sacrificing truth. I kept his notebook on my desk, flipping through it occasionally. There were notes about books, reminders about patience, small observations about people that revealed how closely he paid attention. On the last page, in ink slightly faded, he'd written, "Legacy is what remains when no one is trying to impress anyone else." I closed the notebook and looked out the window. The chapter with my birth family wasn't closed in anger. It ended in understanding of myself, of them, of what I could and could not change. I had stopped waiting for them to become who I needed, and in doing so, I'd finally become who I was meant to be. The invitation arrived on thick, cream-colored paper. My name was written in my mother's careful cursive, the loops of each letter slightly exaggerated, as if presentation might soften what the words themselves could not. Family gathering. Sunday at 3 p.m. No apology. No context. Just expectation. I held the card between my fingers for a long moment, then set it down on the kitchen counter beside a bowl of lemons Julian used to keep there year-round. He said the color reminded him that brightness didn't need permission to exist. For a day, I did nothing with the invitation. I went to work, answered emails, watered the garden, but it followed me not loudly, just persistently like an unanswered question. On Sunday morning, I made a decision. I dressed carefully, not extravagantly. Neutral tones, comfortable shoes, the kind of outfit Julian used to call intentional but unprovocative. Before leaving, I stood in the hallway and looked once more at the framed report on the wall. Be clear, I said aloud. Be calm. Their house looked smaller than I remembered. The paint was fresher, the porch furniture newer, but something about it felt compressed, like it had been holding its breath for years. My mother opened the door before I knocked. Elena, she said, surprised. You came? Yes, I replied. For a little while. The living room was full. Aunts I barely recognized. Cousins who looked at me with curiosity, sharpened by rumor. Sienna stood by the window, arms crossed, while Chloe hovered near the kitchen, her hands twisting nervously. My parents ushered me toward the couch like a guest of honor. After small talk and forced laughter, my mother cleared her throat. We wanted to talk, she said. As a family. I nodded. Go on. She clasped her hands together. We've all made mistakes. We were overwhelmed back then. We didn't realize how much you needed us. The room felt warm, heavy. I was 13, I said. I needed someone to come back. Chloe's eyes filled with tears. Sienna shifted uncomfortably. My father leaned forward. We're not asking for anything, he said quickly. We just want peace. I let the words settle. Peace doesn't come from pretending, I said. It comes from accountability. My mother's voice trembled. What do you want from us? I thought carefully before answering. Julian had taught me that clarity was a kindness. I want honesty, I said. I want you to acknowledge that you left me not physically alone, but emotionally unclaimed for years. And I want you to understand that I've built a life that doesn't revolve around repairing that. Silence. Finally, Sienna spoke. You really don't need us, do you? It wasn't accusatory. It sounded almost relieved. I don't need you, I said gently. But I'm open to something new if it's real. My mother reached for my hand. I let her hold it for a moment. I can't promise we'll get it right, she whispered. I'm not asking you to, I replied. I'm asking you not to ask me to shrink so it feels easier. That was the line. I stayed another half hour. Enough to be polite, enough to be clear. When I left, the air outside felt cooler, lighter. I sat in my car for a moment, breathing, letting the tension drain from my shoulders. I didn't know what would come of that conversation. And for the first time, I was okay with that. Weeks passed. My parents didn't call. Sienna sent a brief message. I'm thinking about what you said. Chloe sent a photo of her newborn daughter with a caption, I hope she grows up feeling chosen. I stared at the picture longer than I meant to. One evening, as I locked up the house, I caught my reflection in the front hall mirror. I looked older than I used to, but steadier too. Like someone who knew where she stood. Julian's presence was everywhere. But it no longer felt like absence. It felt like foundation. I realized then that the public consequence, the thing everyone expected to be dramatic, had already happened. My family had lost access to the version of me that bent itself to fit their comfort. What they were left with was a woman who could stand quietly in her truth. And sometimes, that's the hardest thing to face. Healing doesn't announce itself. There was no morning where I woke up and felt finished. No clear line where grief ended and peace began. Instead, there were small moments, quiet confirmations that I was living differently now. I noticed it one morning while making breakfast. I'd burned the toast. Badly. The smoke alarm chirped once, sharp and impatient. In the past, moments like that would have sent a ripple of irritation through me, proof that I'd failed at something small. Again. Julian used to laugh when that happened. He'd wave a towel at the alarm and say, perfection is overrated. Presence isn't. So I laughed. I scraped the toast, opened the window, and went on with my day. That was when I realized my inner voice sounded like his. Not controlling, not critical. Calm, reasonable, kind. Work grew fuller, not busier fuller. I took on a leadership role I would have once declined, afraid of taking up too much space. I spoke in meetings without rehearsing every sentence in my head. When I disagreed, I did it without apology. People noticed. You seem settled? A colleague said once, handing me a coffee. Like, you know who you are. I smiled. I'm learning. At home. I finally made one change Julian had always encouraged but never pushed. I removed the framed report card from the hallway, not because it didn't matter, but because I didn't need the evidence anymore. In its place, I hung a photograph of the garden in bloom. Lavender, rosemary, sunlight spilling across the stone path. Proof, not of achievement, but of care. One afternoon, I received a letter from Sienna. Not an email, not a text, a letter. She wrote about therapy, about realizing how often she'd mistaken attention for love. about how easy it had been to ignore me when the family narrative already cast me as fine. "I don't expect forgiveness," she wrote. "I just wanted you to know I see it now." I folded the letter slowly. I didn't respond right away. Julian used to say that insight deserved respect, but not urgency. A week later, I wrote back. "Seeing it matters," I wrote. "What you do with that understanding matters more." Chloe visited once. Just once. She brought the baby. The little girl slept against her chest, warm and impossibly small. We sat in the living room, sunlight drifting across the floor, neither of us rushing to fill the quiet. "She has your eyes," Chloe said softly. I looked at the baby, at the tiny hand curled against her mother's sweater. "I hope she always knows she belongs," I said. Chloe nodded, tears slipping free. "I didn't," she admitted. "Not really. We didn't talk about the will, or the past, or the gaps between us. Sometimes healing isn't about repair. It's about interruption, choosing not to pass the same silence forward." After Chloe left, I stood in the doorway for a long time, watching the street. The same street where, years ago, I'd waited for taillights to return. This time, I wasn't waiting. I was choosing. That winter, I established the Julian Reed Mentorship Fund. Not just scholarships guidance. Pairing students with mentors who would show up consistently, without conditions. At the opening event, a young girl approached me, nervous. 13, maybe 14. "My parents don't really get me," she said quietly. "But my mentor does." I felt my throat tighten. "Then you're already ahead," I told her. "Someone saw you." Later that night, alone again in the house, I lit a single candle at the kitchen table. The same way Julian had on my 13th birthday. I let the memory come, not with pain, but with gratitude. I understood now that family isn't defined by who claims you publicly. It's defined by who protects your becoming. Julian had done that for me, and I had learned to do it for myself. The chapter with my birth family wasn't sealed shut forever. It was simply no longer the central story. If they grew, if they changed, there was room for something honest, but never again at the cost of my dignity. That night, before bed, I opened Julian's notebook one last time and added a line of my own, beneath his final words. "Legacy is what remains when no one is trying to impress anyone else." I wrote, "And healing is what happens when you stop asking to be chosen and choose yourself instead." I closed the book gently and turned off the light. The house settled around me, warm and steady. And for the first time, I felt no need to look back. If you're still listening, I want to leave you with this. For a long time, I thought being chosen meant being wanted loudly, being missed, being chased, being apologized to. I thought love arrived with urgency, with grand gestures, with people finally realizing what they'd almost lost. But that isn't what saved me. What saved me was one quiet man who showed up when no one else did, who didn't rescue me with drama, but with consistency, with patience, with belief. And through him, I learned something that changed the direction of my life forever. You don't heal by convincing people to value you. You heal by building a life where your value is never up for debate. My birth family may never fully understand what they lost when they left a 13-year-old girl behind on her birthday. But I understand what I gained when I stopped waiting for them to come back. I gained my voice, my boundaries, my peace, and I gained the courage to define family not by blood, but by presence. If you're someone who was overlooked, forgotten, or treated like you were fine when you were anything, but please hear me when I say this. The love you didn't receive was not a reflection of your worth. Sometimes it's simply proof that the wrong people were holding the mirror. So here's my question for you, dear listener. If you stopped waiting to be chosen, what kind of life would you choose for yourself? If this story touched something in you, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. Your story might be the one someone else needs to hear. And if you haven't already, please subscribe and support the channel so more voices, more truths, and more healing stories can find their way home. Thank you for sitting with me. Until next time.